The train moved slowly through the endless forests of northern Canada. Inside one of the wooden rail cars sat several senior German officers, men who, only months earlier, had commanded divisions on the battlefields of Europe. They had expected humiliation. That was what the propaganda had promised them. According to everything they had been told, Allied captivity meant cold barracks, harsh guards, and endless punishment, especially here, so far away, in a distant country across the ocean. One of the officers, a gray-haired general who had spent most of the war on the Eastern Front, stared through the narrow window. Snow-covered forests stretched to the horizon. No cities, no ruins, no air raid sirens, just silence. Another officer leaned closer to the window. "Where are the fences?" he muttered quietly. No one answered. The train slowed again as it approached a small station surrounded by pine trees. A wooden sign stood near the tracks. None of the officers could read it clearly from the distance, but they could see soldiers waiting on the platform. Canadian soldiers. The prisoners stiffened. Some expected shouting. Others expected rifles pointed at them. Instead, something strange happened. When the train finally stopped, the guards outside were relaxed. One of them even smiled. The door of the rail car slid open with a loud metallic sound. Cold winter air rushed inside. The prisoners instinctively stood up, preparing themselves for whatever humiliation might come next. A Canadian officer stepped forward. He looked at the group calmly, scanning the faces of the captured generals. Then he spoke in clear German. "Gentlemen," he said, "you have arrived safely." The prisoners exchanged confused looks. That was not the tone they expected. The officer continued, "You will be transported to your camp shortly. Until then, you may step outside for fresh air." Fresh air? One of the generals frowned. Prisoners weren't usually invited outside. Still unsure, the men slowly climbed down from the train. And that was when several of them froze. Because what they saw made no sense. There were soldiers, yes, but there were no barbed wire cages, no angry crowds, no guards screaming orders. Instead, they saw something that looked almost like a quiet rural station in peacetime. Local civilians walked nearby. A truck unloaded crates of food, and the guards stood casually, chatting among themselves. One of the generals whispered under his breath, "This can't be Canada." The officer beside him nodded slowly, because the scene around them looked nothing like the prison camps they had imagined. And the real surprise was still waiting ahead. The prisoners were led toward a line of military trucks waiting near the station. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked. The cold Canadian air felt sharper than anything most of them had experienced in Europe. One of the generals looked around again. Still no shouting. Still no weapons pointed at them. Just calm. A Canadian sergeant gestured toward the back of one of the trucks. "Please, climb in." Please. The word caught several of the prisoners off guard. They slowly stepped into the truck and sat along the wooden benches inside. The truck engine rumbled to life, and within minutes they were moving down a narrow road that cut through endless forests. The landscape felt unreal. Snow-covered fields stretched for miles. Small wooden farmhouses appeared in the distance. Occasionally they passed a truck or a horse sled moving along the road. But the strangest part was something none of the officers expected. People looked at them, not with anger, with curiosity. A group of children standing near a farmhouse watched the convoy pass. One of the boys even waved. One of the generals stared at the scene in disbelief. Back in Europe, prisoners were hidden away, guarded carefully, never allowed near civilians. But here in Canada, they were being driven through open countryside as if they were simply soldiers traveling between bases. The truck bounced over a frozen section of road. One officer leaned closer to another and whispered quietly in German, "Do they realize who we are?" Another shook his head slowly. "I think they do." After nearly 40 minutes, the forest began to thin. The road curved slightly, and ahead they could finally see the camp. The generals prepared themselves for what they had expected all along: barbed wire, guard towers, searchlights. But when the truck rolled closer, the men in the back slowly leaned forward. Their eyes narrowed, because what they saw made several of them completely silent. The camp looked nothing like a prison. There were wooden buildings, yes, but they looked more like small cabins than prison barracks. Smoke rose from chimneys. A few prisoners walked between buildings carrying firewood, and something else immediately stood out. There were fences, but they were simple wooden fences. No tall barbed wire walls, no machine gun towers. One of the generals finally spoke. "This is the prison camp?" The truck stopped near the entrance. A Canadian officer stepped up beside them. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "welcome to your temporary home." For several seconds, none of the captured officers moved, because the place in front of them looked less like a prison and more like a small winter village. And that was only the beginning of the surprises waiting for them inside. The truck engine finally shut off. For a moment, no one moved. The captured German officers sat silently in the back of the truck, staring at the camp in front of them. Smoke drifted slowly from several chimneys, disappearing into the cold winter sky. The place looked quiet, almost peaceful. A Canadian officer stepped forward again and motioned for them to step down. The prisoners climbed off the truck one by one, their boots crunching in the snow. The cold air felt sharp in their lungs as they walked toward the main building. Inside the camp, other prisoners were already moving around. Some carried wood for the stoves. Others shoveled snow from the paths between the buildings. But what surprised the generals most was the atmosphere. There was no panic, no shouting. The prisoners looked calm. One of the generals quietly asked a nearby guard in German, "Is this really a prisoner camp?" The guard nodded. "Yes." The officer looked around again. "But where are the towers?" The guard gave a small smile. "We don't need them." The prisoners exchanged confused looks. The Canadian officer then led them into a large wooden building that smelled faintly of soup and fresh bread. It was the camp dining hall. Inside, long wooden tables were already set. Metal bowls sat neatly in rows. Steam rose from large pots near the kitchen area. One of the prisoners stopped walking. He stared at the tables. "This is for us?" The officer nodded. "Dinner will be served shortly." For a moment, the generals said nothing. Many of them had spent months moving through collapsing front lines in Europe. They had seen cities reduced to rubble. They had watched entire divisions disappear in the chaos of war. Now they stood thousands of kilometers away in the forests of Canada, inside a warm wooden building, staring at a table prepared for them. One of the officers quietly removed his gloves and sat down. He ran a hand across the wooden table as if making sure it was real. Another prisoner leaned toward him and whispered, "Do you think this is some kind of trick?" Before anyone could answer, a cook walked in carrying a large pot. Steam filled the room. Soup, real soup. Bowls were filled and placed in front of the prisoners. The men hesitated at first. Then one of the generals finally lifted his spoon. He tasted the soup slowly. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked up at the others and quietly said something none of them expected to hear that day. "This might be the safest place we've been in years." The room fell silent. Outside, snow continued to fall quietly over the camp, and far away, across the ocean, the war was still raging. But here, in the Canadian wilderness, the captured generals were beginning to realize something surprising. For them, the war had already ended.